This is a very delayed wrap-up of the books that I read in May and June. It's a little different, in part because it covers 2 months, obviously, but mostly because the titles this time were selected beforehand, which is something I almost never do because I'm too much of a mood reader for that, and this is also the reason why I don't do monthly TBRs. So the reason why this time I had a list of titles planned for reading is that during the month of May, a few channels that I follow, particularly one that I'm going to link below, Break Even Books, but also some others, they do this reading challenge that's dedicated to Star Wars because May. So every year the rules for the Star Wars themed reading challenge are a little different. But generally there are several reading prompts that are all somehow connected to different Force user abilities. A small clarification, the prompts are all Star Wars themed, but there is no requirement for the actual books that you pick to have anything to do with Star Wars or even to be in the same genre or similar. You can pick literally any book, any kind of book, as long as it fits the prompts. Depending on how many prompts you manage to complete, you gain ranks in either the Jedi or the Sith hierarchy, and there's also a list of neutral prompts that can be used to replace any prompt on either side, as long as you don't use any one prompt more than once. To reach the highest rank, it usually requires doing 5 prompts, so that's 5 books for each side, and there are also some additional challenges depending on which side you pick. Last year, I was feeling particularly ambitious, so I did all the prompts on the dark side, and then I did all the prompts on the Jedi side as well, because why not? Plus some of the additional prompts for both sides. And all in all, I think I read about 20 books in a single month, and that was a mistake, because I was picking the first books I came across that seemed to fit the prompts without having the faintest idea what kind of books they were, and if I was even likely to enjoy them, as long as they met the requirements. And I ended up reading, honestly, a lot of junk. A lot of books, many of which were really short, and I don't even remember most of them anymore. So this year I decided that I still wanted to do both sides, but I was a lot pickier with the titles. Almost all titles this time come from the depths of my own TBR, and because my list now contained quite a few books on the heavier side, I decided to stretch the challenge over 2 months instead of 1. I think I was perfectly justified in doing that, since I was doing both sides. So that's what I was reading during May and June. Okay, this time around, apart from choosing which side you wanted to play for, you could also choose what race, or species rather, you wanted to be, and from the available options I wanted to be Twi'lek because that's my favorite Star Wars race. So to earn the right to play as Twi'lek, the condition was to read a romance book. The one I picked was recommended by a friend, and it had spent a couple of years on my TBR, so it finally got its chance to be read, and that's You Deserve Each Other by Sarah Hogle. It's about a couple who are engaged to be married, but once they start living together, they find out they're not really happy with each other, but for whatever reasons, neither of them wants to be the one to break the engagement, so they start doing their worst to make the other person break up with them. It's 3.5 stars on my scale. I enjoyed it well enough, even if it did become a little ridiculous at some moments, but overall, yes, a really fun, cute, entertaining story. Another prompt concerned the weapon you chose to wield, and of course I went for lightsaber. I mean, come on, is it even Star Wars if lightsabers are not involved? So the prompt here was to read a book whose cover was the color opposite your favorite color on a color wheel. So my favorite color being blue, that made the opposite color some shade of orange, and the book I picked was The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared by Jonas Jonasson. This is a Swedish author, and this is a book that I had to read in translation. And it's also been patiently waiting its turn in my TBR. I remember it was really popular a few years ago, at least where I am. And I finally got to read it, and it's a delightful book. Easy 4 stars. It's literally what it says in the title. An old man decides on his own birthday, just when he turns 100, that he's not interested in the celebration that has been arranged for him in the nursing home where he lives. So he climbs over the window in his room and goes roaming. And through some purely accidental events and circumstances, goes on a series of absolutely wild adventures. It's silly, it's absurd, it's ludicrously implausible and doesn't take itself seriously, and I enjoyed it tremendously. I can see why it gained the popularity that it did. Now, I've read a few books by Scandinavian authors, and I may be imagining things, but it seems to me that there's some flavor in the writing from that part of the world that's pretty unique to that region, and it thoroughly agrees with me, and I should probably read more. The next prompt was partners, again with different options depending what side you are playing for, and I chose to do only one, and it's a neutral one, and it's droids. And the requirement was no people on the cover. And for this I chose The City and The City by China Miéville. Or is it Miéville? That's me with names. That is another veteran title from my TBR. 4 stars again, but I can say this book impressed me more than some 5-star reads, and this book has probably the most unique premise of everything that I read this year. I'm not even sure what genre it belongs in. It's definitely more science fiction-y than anything else, but also maybe not quite. The idea is that there are 2 nations, 2 different cultures, sharing the same geographical space, and each of them is pretending that the other one doesn't exist in their own perception of everyday reality. There's a murder that needs to be solved, and in the course of the investigation, the main character, who is native to one of these nations, cities, is forced to interact with the other city. It's a very difficult book to describe, and it's difficult to explain why this is such a big deal. But this book will be getting a dedicated review, because it's not often that I feel so mind blown by a book. It gave me so many thoughts. My head was buzzing for weeks after reading it. So there will be a full review coming up at some point in the future. And now on to the actual Force ability prompts, starting with the dark side. And the first one is Deadly Sight. And I skipped this one. It required reading a book that was in a bad physical condition, and that's a problem for me because I read almost exclusively ebooks lately, so I had the option of replacing this one with a neutral prompt, but I decided to just skip it, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So the next prompt was Memory Walk. Read a book that came out 15 plus years ago. My pick for this was Greenglass House, also a long-time resident in my TBR. It's a middle grade book about a boy whose parents run an inn or guest house, I guess, and the building itself has some very intriguing history of its own, and the story is about one winter during a typically quiet time when several guests arrive unexpectedly, and each one has a story of their own, a pursuit of their own that's somehow connected to the house and its history, and the boy, the main character, gets to find out what their stories are and what their secrets are little by little. It was 3 stars for me. I liked it well enough. I must say I was impressed with how well written this book was. I particularly appreciated the prose and the writing choices, even if I wasn't too invested in the story itself. The next dark side ability is Drain Knowledge. Read a book over 600 pages. and it counts as 2 ability prompts. So this is why I could skip the first prompt, since this one now counts as 2, I could still get the required 5 ranks for the dark side to get to the top level, as long as I didn't skip any others. The book I chose for this one is The Priory of the Orange Tree. I'm not exactly sure how many pages it is in physical form, but it's quite thick, definitely more than 600, and that's also a book that's been waiting for my attention for a long time. And this was my first less than positive experience overall. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot in this book that I liked and appreciated, but it also caused me a lot of facepalming. And because it's so huge, and because the author chose to cram so many things in there, there are countless things that could and did end up doing a disappointing job. So I would rate it 3 stars if I'm in a generous mood. But there were a lot of moments when it felt like a 2-star experience, to be honest. It's not easy to summarize what it's about, but essentially there is a big bad enemy who will destroy the world unless he's stopped. But to stop him, the 2 main political powers in the world need to put aside their differences and work together and overcome ages of hostility. And there's a secret society that's been operating behind the scenes for hundreds of years, and a religion whose initial idea was twisted and misrepresented by those in power. And there are dragons, and in the middle of all of it we have a slow burn romance between 2 powerful women. And I know this all sounds awesome, and some of it is, but the execution of a lot of it sadly just didn't work for me. The next prompt is Transfer Essence. Read a book off of someone else's TBR. And for this I went through a few people's lists on Goodreads until I found a title that I had heard about before, and it sounded interesting and like a perfect fit for my tastes. So I decided that's the one, and that was Declare by Tim Powers. So in a nutshell, it's a spy thriller that about halfway, or maybe 2/3 in, morphs into supernatural horror. With regard to rating, it felt like 3 stars while I was reading it, but curiously enough, sometime after finishing it, I still think about it, and I have questions, and now I want to reread it. So let's say 3.5 stars, because it obviously did its job better than I initially thought. And the last prompt on the dark side is Force Lightning. Read a book you're shocked you haven't read yet. And my pick for this is The Curse of Chalion by Lois Bujold. And that, my friends, is one of the fastest 5-star ratings I ever remember giving. It's not a grand scale epic fantasy. It's a slow burn, almost intimate story about a man who, through his loyalty to the family he's chosen to serve, becomes entangled in the intrigues and maneuverings of the gods themselves. It's an exquisitely, beautifully told story, and it may be another one that gets a full review at some point, if I can come up with the words to do it justice. And with that, my quota of 5 dark side points was complete, and I got to claim the title, Dark Lord of the Sith. But because it's me, I can't just leave an entire side of the Force unexplored, so my character, my persona, went on to see if they could infiltrate the Jedi Council as well, so here we go with the light side. Prompt number 1, Sever Force. Read a non-fiction. For this one, I picked a fun book on English punctuation of all things, and that's Eats, Shoots and Leaves. I don't think I've mentioned this before. Maybe I have, I'm not sure. I love language. I love language studies and linguistics and related fields, and language as a phenomenon with all its possible aspects and conventions and inventions such as punctuation. I find all of that just endlessly fascinating. So this book is not a textbook, it's not a guide how to punctuate your sentences. It's more of a tongue-in-cheek rant against illiteracy and against the most widespread mistakes and the incorrect ways people use, for example, apostrophes and such. And also a bit of a look at the history of punctuation and punctuation marks and how they were used in the past and how it all came to be what it is today. I did have fun with this book. It's very difficult for me, I think I've mentioned that before, to rate a non-fiction book, since most of my usual criteria don't apply. And the one thing I have left to judge it by is the author's voice and the writing style and position, I guess. So I guess 3 stars? It didn't blow my mind or anything. There were definitely parts where I disagreed with the sentiments expressed by the author, but I did have fun reading it. So yeah, that's 3 stars is about right. Prompt number 2 on this side was Jedi Mind Trick. Read a book with a similar premise or cover as a book you've previously read in your life. I picked one where the premise sounded very much like amateur detectives solving a murder. I've read several books with this premise and I usually love them. The book is The Whole Cat and Caboodle. This is an interesting title. By Sofie Ryan. I don't know, it was not exactly what I expected. It was alright. I probably don't sound very enthusiastic, but it was fine. Not a disappointment, just a bit of mismatch between my expectations and what the book actually turned out to be. Yes, it is a cozy mystery, just as it sounds. It just focused too much on things I didn't particularly care about, and there's a cat in it, which I admit was one of the reasons why I was interested in the book. But it reads like it was written by someone who's never had a cat in their life. Anyway, 3 stars maybe? Maybe 3 plus. 3 plus. Next prompt was Plant Surge, read a book with nature on the cover. This one was Pines by Blake Crouch. As you can see, there are some trees on the cover. This is the runner-up for greatest disappointment for this challenge. At this point, I've read 3 books by this author, and one was amazing. That was Recursion. I read it a few years ago. I was absolutely impressed. Then I read Dark Matter, and that one was meh. And now Pines was just bad. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have started with a more recent novel and then gone back to check out earlier works by the author, because you know how writers usually develop, they get better with each next book. Maybe that's what happened here. Hopefully that's what happened here. Anyway, Pines is about a Secret Service agent who goes to a small town to investigate something, and a lot of creepy stuff happens. And it's all given a rational explanation at the end, but it's so ridiculous and implausible. We have a saying in my country, when we say about some story that it was stitched with the white thread showing, it means that I can see where the parts of your story don't quite fit well together. So don't try to sell it to me as a convincing, coherent whole, because I can see that it's not. And that's exactly how I felt about this book. And then the writing. I mean, the writing was the major reason why I didn't enjoy Dark Matter much. And here, in Pines, it's the same thing, only worse. So, all in all, 2 stars, and that's me being generous. And the main reason why it's not 1 is because it still holds up a little better than the next book in the list, which we are coming to now. For this one, the prompt was Force Valor, read a book under 275 pages. I went with my book club's pick for the month of May, which was The Cat Who Saved Books. Yes, another book with a cat. Sadly, it did not save this book. I have nothing good to say about this book. The only way I can imagine its existence making sense is if it was written for children and like very early middle grade, but it was not marketed as a children's book. Now, I want to be fair, this was translated from Japanese, so it's quite possible that something got lost in translation. Maybe it sounds awesome in the original language, but one way or another, the book that I got to read was just terrible. The characters, the dialogue, the narrative, the exposition bits, the message. Don't even let me get started about the message, because this book is obnoxiously preachy. So obviously it's going to be 1 star. It's been a long time since a book managed to make me genuinely angry. And not at something that's happening in the book, but at the book itself. But to wrap up the challenge on a positive note, the last prompt on the Jedi side was transfer force, read a borrowed book. It can be from a library, a friend, Kindle Unlimited, etc. I don't have any borrowed books around me currently, and I didn't feel like renewing Kindle Unlimited for this. I stopped it some time ago until I can go through some of my TBR pile at least. So I chose to swap this prompt with one from the neutral list, and I chose Doppelganger, where the requirement was do a reread. I decided to reread the Aeronaut's Windlass by Jim Butcher. This is the first book of the Cinder Spires, which is one of the 2 series by Jim Butcher that are not the Dresden Files. It's a steampunky mix with... I recently encountered the term crystal punk, and I think it might apply here. Basically, in the far future, all of humanity lives in these giant towers called spires because the surface has become uninhabitable, at least for humans. It's too dangerous. So each spire is roughly the equivalent of one country, nation, and the spires have multiple levels, and each level is like a city or region, I guess. They use airships for trade, and for travel, and for warfare, and yeah, there are conflicts between the separate spires, nations, and we follow a bunch of interesting characters as they get involved in spire politics, and there are talking cats. I know it sounds ridiculous, but trust me, Butcher has somehow made it work. I enjoyed this book very much when I first read it, and I enjoyed it just as much on the reread as the first time around, if not more. The next book is coming out later this year, I think November, and this was the perfect time to refresh my memory about book 1, so 4 stars easily, and I'm really hyped up for book 2. And with that, my Jedi career reached the highest level. I completed 5 prompts and claimed the rank of Jedi Grandmaster. And so here I am, in all my Twi'lek glory, having conquered both sides of the Force. Guys, thank you very much for staying with me while I was going over my Force journey. As usual, stick around if you'd like to hear more of my thoughts about books, fantasy, sci-fi, and such things. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't. I post videos extremely irregularly. Take care of yourself. I'll see you around.